everyone. I'm KL Mary.
And I'm Soda.
We are back with another podcast. This time we're going to talk about side characters from the original series. We're going to walk through primary bridge crew. We'll talk about characters who had repeat appearances, and we'll talk about characters who were favorites in Fanon. We will touch on at the end any new canon characters for the original series, whether they're from Star Trek Discovery and TV or reboot Star Trek original series in the movies. So, Soda,
Yes.
talking about the primary bridge crew. When I was making the list, I did it in order of age,
Hmm.
which puts at the top are one of my favorite bridge crew characters, which is Montgomery Scott, also known as Scotty, chief engineer of the USS Enterprise.
Yeah, and I also think that of all the, let's call them secondary characters, he's probably the one closest to be a main character. He probably has the most appearances out of the main trio. And I think he also he didn't really appear in the pilot, but he was like mentioned there somewhere. Like I think Pike called him on the com.
I think you're right, and even eventually you see his name in the credits, James Doohan.
Hmm.
I will say I absolutely agree with you. I think anytime I've seen a picture that isn't just Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, it's Kirk, Spock, McCoy, and Scott.
Yeah.
Or Scotty. And from here, I'm just going to refer to him as Scotty because we all know him by that nickname.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think he also got a lot more focus in the second and third season when they narrowed down the. In the first season, it felt like a rotation of characters along with Kirk. In the second season, when they narrowed down the focus, it was Kirk, Spock, McCoy, and Scotty. Basically, they got episodes. They even had an episode dedicated to him, which is very rare in the series.
Yes. And we'll touch on how other characters have appeared in episodes, and there's really only, I can not even count on one hand the number of characters that were like him and had sort of a episode centric theme around them.
Mm-hmm.
For me, Scotty he's kind of the hero of the Enterprise because you know where I'm going this. I feel like he saves the day more often than Kirk does, at least when they're in space and the ship needs to do something miraculous or, is on its last legs. I think if it weren't for Scotty running engineering the way he did and able to essentially create miracles down there in the bowels of the ship, that Kirk couldn't have pulled off some of the gambles that he did in the episodes. And I would even say that his role is acknowledged by everyone on the bridge.
Yeah, Scotty is very capable. I think everybody knows it. I think he might be also the longest serving member of the crew on the Enterprise.
Yes, and he did serve under Captain Pike, correct?
Yes, so, but also did Spock. But because of his age, I think he maybe even served longer.
Mm-hmm.
I think just everybody acknowledges that he's a very capable man, and unlike say Kirk or any other person in command, Kirk and Spock basically, he kind of like McCoy, he just really likes his job. He doesn't want to like go into command. I think he could if he wanted to, but he just likes doing his job. He just likes engineering. He likes working with the machines. Even in his downtime, he likes reading technical manuals. So he's just this kind of really down to earth guy, just likes his job, is very good at his job, and everybody kind of acknowledges it.
I also think it's very interesting that Montgomery Scott is basically the bridge crew character that most frequently commands the Enterprise when either Kirk or Spock is not there. Well, I'm sure, one, he is a senior officer, obviously, on the crew, but I'm not sure that it has anything to do with his age. It probably has to do with his experience, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, seniority basically. He that's why I say I think he's the one that served the most on the Enterprise, not of all the characters we know of.
And I have to say, even though his love seems to be with engineering, he had a pretty good command presence when he was in the chair. And sometimes his decisions surprised me with the way he would handle, let's say, being faced with a Klingon ship.
Yeah, I think, like I said before, because he's such a down-to-earth guy, he's a very cool head. He's not like really, he's not rash. He doesn't just jump into decisions.
Right, you can see that he's a very mature officer.
Exactly.
Let me ask you a question. What do you think about the fact that they used James Doohan? Well, let's say he is not Scottish. And then created a character not only called Montgomery Scott, but who everybody calls Scotty, and has pretty fun brogue to listen to every time he opens his mouth. I think if people didn't know that his nickname was Scotty, they'd be like, that Scottish guy on the show.
Yeah, and he also has like the how do you call it? How do you call the pipe instrument?
The bagpipes.
The bagpipes in his room, yeah. Just in case you haven't noticed, he's Scottish.
And his, I believe his family Tarleton.
Yeah.
Which is, represents, his heritage.
The original series was very much, a crew of every nationality, every ethnicity, and Scotty just was one of those people. He's a very obvious Scottish guy, and Uhura was an African, and Sulu was Asian, and just the thing they did in the 60s.
I just always thought it was funny that they decided to take we're going to have this Scottish character who's called Scotty, and his last name is Scott. I mean, he walks around with the bagpipes and he's just it seems to be very proud of his heritage, and he has all these funny little, the funny way that he talks.
Yeah.
It's so stereotypical Scottish. As they perceived it in the 60s.
Yeah, and he was an engineer, which apparently is another stereotype from back then.
Mm-hmm. And I think the other sort of stereotype that went along with that character was that he liked to drink.
Especially whiskey, yeah.
Yes, which is, I think, another perception of anyone who is Scottish or Irish. I'm not sure why.
I wouldn't know. I guess, the whiskey did come from Scotland. Scotch did come from Scotland. Mm-hmm. So I guess a guy named Scott who is Scottish and really likes to drink scotch.
Oh, and something else that always intrigued me, at least in Fanon, it's very popular that Scotty somehow distills his own version of, like, moonshine down in engineering.
Yeah.
Where do you think this came from?
He likes to drink, and I think anybody who is known, like the chemistry or engineering students in university, can tell you that they like to do a lot of do-it-yourself kind of operations for all kinds of things. And some of them really do distill their own alcohol, and I guess it just made sense.
Well, what do you think about the track of his career as we go into the original series movies? He eventually becomes a captain, right?
I think so. I don't think we ever seen him actually command a ship. I think it's more like a title. Like he himself says that he mostly likes to. He still really loves being in engineering. He doesn't really enjoy commanding ships. I think maybe you're thinking about the Next Generation series where he also appeared.
I think that was my second point. He's also one of only one of three characters that you actually see later from the original series in the Next Generation. Yeah. Although the way in which he returns is different than everyone else.
Yeah, very different.
Spoiler alert.
But I do like that in this that episode we got a confirmation that Scotty is actually that much of a miracle worker. He likes to overestimate how long things will get done, so he can appear like a miracle worker when he gets them done quicker.
I still believe in his powers.
He's still good. He's still a good engineer and all of that. I think it's a good advice for, in general, when someone tells you ask you how long will it take you to do something, always overestimate. It will always make you look better, eventually.
There's one last thing I wanted to say about Scotty before we move on. Am I allowed to talk about the original series, or the alternate original series version?
Of course.
Okay. So before we move off of Scotty, I just wanted to give you an idea of what he's like in the alternate original series, or as we know, the Abrams verse movies. Clearly, a lot of the things about him are the same. He's one of the older members of the crew. His love of engineering is probably only surpassed by, in this case, his love of sandwiches. I'm not sure that we ever actually see the man drinking. But then again, they're always like in the middle of a very dangerous situation in the movies. Probably the thing that stuck out the most for me with Scotty in the original series, rebooted version, is that he actually takes offense when the second movie, Into Darkness, when they're going to enact a military operation to go after Khan, or at this time who they know as John Harrison, because he has in fact already committed an act of terrorism. And they are loading missiles onto the Enterprise. Kirk finds out that the person who is basically refusing to approve the missiles being shipped aboard the Enterprise is Scotty, because he basically calls Kirk out and says, "Since when are we a military operation and not an exploratory operation? Like, why are you putting these warheads on my ship?"
It's very interesting.
Yes, Kirk overrides him, and those missiles play a bigger part in the overall plot of the movie.
Yeah.
But nobody else at that point literally called out the fact that this is not what Starfleet is supposed to be, an aggressive, militarized agency. And he seems very upset that not only can be perceived in that way, that they're going to act with that type of aggression.
Yeah.
And so it really, really warmed me. I liked him already. I already liked Simon Pegg's portrayal of this character. It's kind of almost like a Mad Hatter engineer who could obviously create miracles, or was always, find a way to do something better. And he does, in fact, do a lot to save the day, not just with Kirk, but overall. But just the fact that he has these principles, and he's not afraid to stand by them and even stand up to authority when he feels that his principles are threatened.
Yeah, I think it relates to what we talked about just a few minutes ago, about him being very mature and very calm and not rushing into anything. I think he's not the type of guy who, well, he does start a bar fight, but he's not a very violent guy on the regular, Doesn't seem like he supports violence. And it makes a lot of sense to me that he wouldn't want his ship becoming a warship, basically.
Exactly. And I will say, I think you really have to rile him up to get him to start a fight.
Yeah.
Those Klingons were doing a pretty good job by insulting essentially his lady love, which is the Enterprise. I think if anybody rivals Kirk in that area, a love of that ship, it is Montgomery Scott. Well, let's move on to the next one on the list. Again, we're just going down by age, and this is Hikaru Sulu. Just going to refer to him as Sulu here. I was a little surprised when I was trying to determine how old everybody was, and he seemed to be the second oldest, although this is not official canon. I think this came from Memory Beta, not Memory Alpha. But
it makes sense. I think he was the second one.
Well, he's the second oldest of the bridge crew, minus Kirk and Spock and McCoy. He's basically in his late 20s. He's supposed to be perceived as in his late 20s.
I think it makes sense because he was also, wasn't he the first one of the bridge crew to get his own captainship?
His own captaincy, yes.
Also, I don't think we ever heard his first name said aloud in any episode or movie, basically.
No, we did not. So I'm not really sure how it is that is his first name, but Memory Alpha seems to agree not just with fans, but as far as canon is concerned.
I
That
think
is
maybe he
his
appeared in
name.
an episode of Voyager. I haven't seen Voyager yet, but maybe there they revealed his first name. Possible.
As you know, he is a helmsman, right? He's
Yeah.
sort of the pilot of the ship. That his path to captaincy seemed a very natural course. You can see that I think of all the other bridge crew members, Sulu is most like Kirk in personality. I say that because whenever there is sort of a dangerous situation, you see that Sulu is not afraid to stand at the forefront with the security officers and whatnot. And, you could argue that he's trained to be that way. But I think I've always had the perception that he sort of enjoys it.
Yeah. I think also in basically the episode where we got the most out of Sulu, the Naked Time. Oh, not for most, yeah, for most of it he was
Infamous.
drunk, but you could say that by his behavior when he lets loose, let's call it, he enjoys adventure, he enjoys having fun, he's very, he's very forward. He's a lot like Kirk in some ways, yeah.
Other than that, we don't know much more about him except that one part where you see him in a botany lab and seeming to be very
Yeah.
friendly with the sentient plants.
Yeah.
If you'll recall Gertrude, which I think added a nice little twist to his characterization because he's not only in the hot seat, like one of the hot seats at the bridge, right? I mean, if he's not able to react quickly to any situation and to his captain's commands, they could potentially all be killed if he's not able to perform his job, or he's not quick in his job. So, as I said, you kind of expect him to be more like Kirk in personality, and yet you see this supposed other part of him that really enjoys the sciences, if you will.
But also I think in the Pleasure Planet episode, in the Shore, yes, exactly.
Shore
We see he's also interested in ancient, according to the series, ancient weapons, and we also saw it before again in the Naked Time that he has a sword, an actual, fencing sword.
And I think I read somewhere that they were going to give him a katana because, of course, it's the Japanese choice of weapon when it comes to swords. And he said no and decided that he wanted to have a fencing sword, even though he didn't actually know how to fence.
George Takei said once in an interview that when he applied for the role, he put on his resume very specifically that he knows fencing because he didn't want to be, put in a stereotypical role. So he knows fencing, not like a Japanese martial art or something like that. And that's why when the episode came, they gave him a fencing sword, and he studied fencing, learned it specifically for the episode. And then he liked it so much that he just kept doing it. I think he's doing it to this day or something like that.
Which is a very neat way for him to break out of the stereotype that were placed upon Asian actors at the time. And even today, I would say. I think we could say overall that, Sulu, he's good at his job, and he's a bit adventurous, and he's also a very learned
and
fellow.
He has very diverse interests.
Right, because we see him, looking at botany one day and talking about, quote, ancient Turian firearms the next. Sulu is one of those characters that never had an episode centered around him, even though I think his most standout scene was in fact from the Naked Time. Would you agree?
He also didn't get a lot of focus in the movies. Like some characters did get some very iconic scenes in the movies. I can't really remember one of his.
No, other than the fact that he was slated to be the captain of the Excelsior, you pretty much only see him partnered with another bridge crew member. For instance, in The Final Frontier, when he and Chekov are pretending to be caught in a blizzard because they're actually lost and don't want to admit it. He did seem to be put into more comedic scenes in the movies course, most of the movies were just comedy, I would argue. With a little bit of drama in between.
In the most comedic movie, the fourth movie, I also can't remember him doing something that's very specifically him. Like he was piloting a helicopter. That's all I remember him doing in the movie.
It's very interesting. His portrayal by John Cho in the rebooted verse is, I'd say, a little more like Sulu's characterization intensified. You do, in fact, see Sulu fighting alongside Kirk. You do get the sense that he has actually more of a commanding presence than he does in the original series. One point, he's even in charge of the ship, of the Enterprise, while they're facing an enemy, and he delivers this line. It actually makes him seem kind of scary, because he pretty much tells them, we're going to destroy you if you don't do what we want. But he delivers it with, and here's the thing I love about John Cho's performance in the rebooted verse. John Cho delivers all of his action scenes, the comedy, and even just, the intense scenes where he's in the captain's chair and delivering this warning. He does it all with a very tightly leashed emotions. So he actually reminds me a lot of a mature captain like Pike, who we'll talk about later on. He doesn't get excited, like, visually, he doesn't look nervous visually, even if he says later on that he was nervous. He delivers it all with almost a straight face, in a very contained way that actually, I think, makes him seem far more mature than some of his, the other bridge crewmen that he works with. So I find that a very interesting take on Sulu's characterization. But you could easily see how if Spock was not on the Enterprise, that Sulu could actually be Kirk's right hand.
That is interesting, especially when you consider the relationship of the actors. But how big was his role in the movies in general?
Well, in the first and second movie, his role was no bigger than anybody else's. Anybody else who was not Kirk or Spock, because that's just how their characters were treated in the scripts. I mean, he did at first appear a little bit green. He's actually, when the Enterprise is taking off to answer this distress call, and it's under the captaincy of Pike. Sulu, it's almost like it's Sulu's first time being in the pilot seat, because he can't seem to get the ship to go forward. And Pike is basically like, did you release the emergency brake? Now, and Sulu's like, oh yeah. But that is I think the only time you see Sulu actually kind of nervous in his new role as a pilot. But even later on in the movie, right, when he has to do like daring feats, like basically jump down through the atmosphere and then land on this drill that's halfway down, and then fight some Romulans on the drill, and he whips out a sword, and I mean, none of that seems to faze him. But that first moment in the pilot seat did. Way too many spoilers.
That's interesting.
So basically, back to your point, or back to your question, Soda, his role did not seem as embellished as, like I said, as Kirk or Spock or even Uhura. I think who had more of a role in the rebooted movies than any of the other characters. But what you did see of him, you liked. And then in Beyond, in the third movie, pretty much the script writers evened out the screen time that all of the bridge crew had, and they were all sort of integral to the plot. That was a very nice change. But it also gave you more of a sense of Sulu's in the right place, being on the bridge crew of the Enterprise.
Well, I think if what you're saying is true, he probably had a bigger role in the third movie than he had in any other iteration of series.
Yes, it's true, actually. That's even when he had his characterization. I mean, when they arrive on Yorktown, and then you see that he actually has a husband and a daughter. You knew more about his personal life than you actually do any of the other bridge crew members, which is something I don't think we get in the original series.
But in the original series, you don't even get it about. I mean, even about Kirk, we just know about Spock's personal life.
Yeah, I think their treatment of him in the rebooting universe it could have been better, but John Cho, he sold it from the first scene. So even if he was barely in the movie, it seems like you were always paying attention.
What I've seen of John Cho is a very good actor, so I'm not surprised. Another thing I want to touch about Sulu before we move on is that his general importance in terms of, Gene Roddenberry's vision of an all-inclusive future about all the races and stuff, even though Sulu didn't have a very big role in any episode, pretty much, just the fact that he was there, and he was always there, just in front of Kirk, always there in the series, is just, it was groundbreaking in and of itself in the 60s, We talked about how George Takei didn't want to have a stereotypical role, and I think Roddenberry tried to respect. He pretty much respected it. That Sulu wasn't it wasn't like a caricature. He wasn't really great at martial arts. He had a sense of humor. We didn't get to know him too much, but he was always there. So even that was something.
Couldn't have put it better myself, Soda. The next character, which is Uhura. I'm going to call her Uhura because in the original series, I don't think we ever find out her first name.
Yeah, I think it's a very similar Sulu situation, though she had a bigger role, I think.
Yes, and I will say that in Abrams' verse, it is established that her name is Nyota. A lot of people now, I think, identify her as Nyota Uhura, just based on the fact that she was given a first name in the Abrams verse. Again, to your point, we just don't know what her actual name is. I think the other favored name for her is Penda, and I believe that comes from a Star Trek novel.
I think it was a name that was popularized in fan fiction before it was in a novel, because I know I saw it around a lot in fan fiction.
Right.
I don't remember. It has a very meaningful, it has a meaning, something that is meaningful to Star Trek, but in Swahili. So does Nyota. If I'm not mistaken, Nyota means something like star or hope or something like that.
Yes, that I was going to mention that. So I find that very interesting because you don't even get the sense that there's Swahili heritage to Uhura in the original series. And
that's not exactly true, because I remember the one episode where that robot took her singing or her language or something like that, and she reverted back to Swahili.
Yes, other than the fact that she reverted to Swahili.
Yeah.
I'm talking about, where she grew up and how she came to Starfleet, and essentially the kind of full background that we have for someone like Spock, or someone, that eventually we learn about Kirk. We just don't know these things about Uhura, and the way that we don't really know them about Scott or Sulu.
We don't know much about her, but I think that in her biography, the actress's name I just forgot.
Nichelle Nichols.
Nichelle Nichols, exactly. She wrote about how she and Roddenberry were close even before the series, and she and Roddenberry talked about how her character will be and what is her history, where did she come from, and all of those things, and then it never came up on screen, basically.
So good. So she had an idea of what to base her character off of.
Exactly, and Roddenberry imagined that in the future, all the countries in Africa become united in some sort of Pan-African federal country or something like that. And she comes from the Swahili region, I guess, of that huge Pan-African country, and she studied that's why she studied languages, which is why it's popular in fan fiction too, that she knows all the languages, and so forth and so forth.
Even though she is essentially the communications officer of the Enterprise, and that's her role. And she seems to be very good at what she does. I think there were limited instances in which she was ever portrayed as speaking in a language other than English.
That's what I said, because
I find that very interesting because in Abrams' verse, they actually make a point of having, say, for instance, Uhura having a conversation in Klingon, when they end up on the Klingon home world and are, essentially about to get their butts kicked. She's the one who steps up to negotiate with them because she speaks the language. I mean, of course, Zoe Saldana does a great job of making it making it look like she actually knows how to speak the language. That really stuck out to me because I pretty much never remember Uhura in the original series showing off her skills in that way.
Yeah, I think we haven't really seen her do anything besides, well, there are a few episodes, but mostly we just see her sit on the bridge and be the space
which is
secretary,
a shame because
basically.
we find out that not only is she good at her job, but she has other talents. As you brought up, her singing. Yeah. We also know the actress herself, Nichelle Nichols, was a dancer. There were other things that she could have brought to the role than just being the space secretary on the bridge.
But though I think I read somewhere that it was canonized, maybe it was actually written in the novel, that in one of the novels, that after the robot we talked about, they took her language, I guess, or English maybe. She took away her singing, and after that she really stopped singing. Before that she was singing in a lot of episodes, but after that she stopped singing. Actually,
that makes me sad.
Kind of, but
I hope that's not the truth.
But she started singing again in the 5th movie, so maybe
I actually
she
thought it was
eventually got it
heartbreaking,
back.
that scene where she had to learn how to read again. Her ability to, as you said, to communicate was just stripped from her, and that's who she is on the bridge crew. She's a communications officer. So I think in that episode, even though she seemed to be progressing very quickly, with Chapel helping her, it made me wonder what sort of rehabilitation would she have to go through and how quickly in order to be fit for duty.
Well, since you seem to come back very soon after the incident, I assume the future has a very advanced ways to deal with it, and teach her again all those things she forgot.
It's futuristic technology and education.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of what else stands about Uhura to me. Oh, Uhura never actually had an episode where it was prominently about her. But she did have very memorable moments. And I think one of the ones that stands out to me was her role in Mirror Mirror. You were actually able to see that, in this new situation, among all these aggressive mirrorverse reflections of the people that she knew, she could hold her own. So I think that was perhaps one of the first times that I saw her as a tough lady, if you will. And I thought, yes, this is a woman who is trained to be in Starfleet and, who has the fortitude to do it. This is why she's not just a yeoman. She's a full-fledged officer on a actual command, career track. She didn't do the stereotypical female type reaction that you might have expected in another show.
I mean, she had this moment where she was like, "Captain, I'm scared." But she got over it pretty quick.
Those moments actually felt offbeat to me, almost like someone just put it in the script so that Shatner could say something else. Because I didn't, from that point on, at which in Mirror Mirror, where she was able to hold her own, and even though she did seem scared, she could take care of herself. Anything past that point where she looked like she couldn't handle the situation, I just brushed aside as that's just weak characterization. That's not who she is. My favorite portrayal of her comes in the movies because she's got a more of a mature feel, and she seems very assured of who she is.
true. I really like in the movies. She really does feel like a very more robust character. Also, of course, there is the famous kiss with Kirk in the in the episode. Well, she didn't really have a very big part in the episode, so that's a shame.
Yes, she did.
But making history, she did make history.
I think, like I said, that part, some of her other scenes in the original series, and then of course the fan scene, the dancing fan scene in the movies.
Yeah, I think that's one of those that we try to forget about.
Exactly.
But
I mean,
yeah.
Really, what was the point of that? But
Yeah,
that
what
whole
was the point
movie,
of
I think
that?
we write off that whole movie. So
Most of it, yeah.
I have to say, Uhura's portrayal in Abrams' verse. I mean, obviously, she's got an elevated role than she does in the original series because not only did they give her a sort of like a romantic interest with Spock, which I think naturally put her on screen more. I think that Zoe Saldana, was an up and coming actress at that time, and she was the face you would most likely see besides Kirk and Spock on the movie posters, if you will. You see where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
And so naturally, like I said, she had more scenes, she had more lines, she was a little more integral to the plot. She's the one who originally picks up on these odd signals in space. Kirk eventually figures out it, means that the distress signal they're all heading off to Vulcan to help them that is actually a trap. But she's portrayed as a woman who is not afraid to ask for what she wants, because when they're all boarding their various starships in order to answer this distress call from Vulcan, she's originally signed to the Farragut, and Spock is amongst all the milling officers, helping people get to their ships. And she goes right up to him and says, "No, I'm on the Enterprise." He just takes one look at her and immediately changes the roster. He goes, "I believe you are." You can see that she is not a pushover. She's not the type of person to say, "I'm scared." Even in Into Darkness, right? She's more willing to fight than you would ever expect of like her characterization in the original series. And then even in Beyond, she essentially does something almost reckless, almost Kirk-like, where she, they're in the middle of this, basically the ship's being attacked, and the ship is, the saucer needs to be separated from the rest of the ship in order for them to try to get away. The automatic controls are not working. Someone has to manually go down there and release it, and Kirk is supposed to do it, and he's of course getting pummeled by these aliens. And so she just goes and does it herself. She just leaves the bridge and goes right into the thick of the danger, activates these manual controls so that they can separate the saucer, which inevitably puts her right into the grasp of the enemy, but she does it anyway. She doesn't hesitate to put herself into danger, knowing that she probably could even die from doing that. So I think that her characterization in Abrams' verse is by far that of a strong woman, if you will. I really like that about her characterization.
Interesting. I think, because I think it wasn't meant to be that way in the original series, but eventually it became like, by default, she became the main female character. She was the female character that appeared the most.
You never thought of Uhura as the female of the group on the bridge crew. She is an equal. Nice. And, as the movies progress from the first to the second to the third, that line between like male and female, it pretty much becomes erased. And then, you see that everybody treats everybody else like an officer, not a man or a woman, or a heterosexual or not a heterosexual, or an alien versus a human, or whatever, Yeah,
that's nice, yeah.
It is very nice. I love Nichelle Nichols' Uhura. I think she did try to portray a black female in a way that was inspiring to other black females who may be viewing the show. And I think Zoe Saldana basically did the same.
I think she was, like Sulu, she tried not to be a stereotype.
Exactly.
Up until then, black characters in general were mostly portrayed as servants, maids, etc. And she wasn't. She was just another member of the crew.
Is there anything else about Uhura that you want to talk about?
Nothing in particular comes to my mind.
Well, if we're going to talk about stereotypes, then we need to talk about Chekov, which is basically our last primary bridge crew member. Actually, I think he is called Pavel, isn't he? In the original series?
Yeah.
He is. Yep. So we do know that his first name is
Pavel.
He's Pavel Chekov. He's the youngest of the bridge crew. He makes his first appearance later in the original series than the others do. Well, I won't say he's your stereotypical Russian, but the way in which Walter Koenig was supposed to portray the role of Chekov, it's almost as if he was there for comedic relief.
Yeah.
With respect to what you would think Americans would think a Russian would sound like, and basically what their attitude would be like.
Yeah, but I think he was a stereotype, but he wasn't as bad as he could have been.
No, absolutely not. And
it was the 60s and the height of the Cold War, and it wasn't as bad as it could have been. He's a mild stereotype considering the time.
Mm-hmm.
He has a bad accent, obviously. His accent, I don't think, is even Russian. He based it on his father, who is Polish. And he thinks everything is made in Russia. I don't know. I've met a few Russian people. They don't think everything is made in Russia. So I don't know where they came up with that.
That's what I'm saying. I think he was there in a more of a comedic role than a serious role as the bridge crew, because not only is he always saying things are made in Russia and people just being like, okay, he likes to flirt. We see that he likes to flirt with the women, and we see that he likes to grumble about having to do things.
You see, I think being a flirt is more about him being a young man, more not really a Russian.
Your junior officer who has yet to shake some of the immaturity that comes with being that age and being in Starfleet. he cracks me up.
He's mostly for comedic relief.
He can also be very hot-headed.
Yeah, exactly. He can be very rash.
I mean, was anyone surprised that he got himself killed first in the Spectre of the Gun? No. Was anyone surprised when the Klingons are antagonizing them in the cafeteria or whatever, and insulting the Enterprise, and Chekov's the one who's like, yes, we're going to fight. He's young. He's kind of a young, impetuous sort of man.
Yeah.
I don't know that we ever get much beyond that, because even in the movies I did not have a good sense that he was any different than he was in the original series. And that's probably because he was actually even less prominent in the movies than he was in the original series.
Yeah, I think he wasn't. Which movie he wasn't in? There was one movie he wasn't even. The first one he was.
The first one, right? Yeah.
He wasn't even in the first one. Yeah. I think that's because in the series he had this role of the young member of the tag along kid.
Right.
Called. It's like he's a member of the group who comes late, and he's like the young one, and everyone is like his older siblings or parents or something like that, in their role toward him. So even though he grew up, in the movies, he still remained the young one. So characterization kind of stuck with him.
I never had the sense that he was particularly skilled at any one thing. He was the navigator, right? But they swapped out the navigators kind of frequently in the original series, so and
yeah.
I just never saw Uhura was the communications officer and linguistics was her background and she was good at what she does. I never got that kind of sense from Chekov. Like, what is it that his specialty was? Maybe he just didn't have one.
actually, in the movies, he was like responsible for the weapons, wasn't he? And
Right.
I actually got the impression that he was kind of jack of all trades. You know, he also worked with Spock, was the main science officer. He was
Right.
a navigator. He was responsible for the weapons. I just got the sense that he was all over the place intentionally. He was just learning everything he could.
I think that actually became a little more popular in Fanon
Yeah.
about Chekov from the original series, is that, oh look, maybe he does have a specialty and he's not really, navigation is something he can do, just like, manning the weapon station he can do, but perhaps what he really is sort of being mentored in is science. And so that way he is able to step in and man the science station when Spock is not there and that sort of thing. And I always thought that was an interesting Fanon theory, that he was being mentored by Spock in that area.
Exactly. I think it fits with his character because he's young, and he, relatively to his age, I think he gets a very good position in the crew. So I think it makes sense that he has a lot of, he knows about a lot of things, that he is learning about a lot of things. He's kind of an overachiever like that.
In the Abrams verse, well, again, Pavel Chekov is by far the youngest member of the crew. In fact, I think McCoy asked if he's even legal to be on the ship. Is that Pavel Chekov's actual specialty in Abrams verse is portrayed as engineering. And so, it seems like not only is he able to help man the helm, but in a pinch, he can get in and, man the transporter, and he's really good at it. And then you see in the second movie where he's actually, when something happens to Scotty, that Chekov, who's actually down in engineering, for some reason or other, Kirk is like, well, you're the new chief engineer. Good luck.
Yeah, that sounds about right with everything I know about the movies, Kirk.
And so, you actually do know that Scotty is in a sense mentoring Chekov in the engineering department, and then Chekov actually has a talent for it. That's what really stood out to me about him in the Abrams verse, was that people like to think maybe Chekov was really good at science as his, sort of secondary profession, but it's engineering in the Abrams verse.
But yeah, he's also very, very young in the movies. Like, the actor portrays him as like what, 19 in the first movie?
Yes. And you do get the sense that he
No.
looks like a baby, but he's portrayed as sort of like a precocious young man. So he's, kind of like genius level, right? That's why he's actually on a ship on the primary bridge crew when he's so much younger than everybody else. He's just too talented, that they can't waste his talents, and he's, got like a fast tracked, if you will, in his career.
Everybody got fast.
Yeah, well, they all did essentially when, the whole Academy class got decimated. Yeah. But in the first movie, what I liked about And Beyond was that Chekov, you could see that Chekov was learning. Like, he was good at engineering, and, he can navigate the hell out of anything, and he can, come up with all these calculations and transport people versus matter and, like, life form material, whatever. But you could see that he was green when it came to command, and he really admired Kirk because Kirk was clearly good at in tactics and basically as the captain. And so you could see that Chekov looked up to him and was sort of like, how do I get to where you are, where I trust my gut instinct on making a command decision that could potentially get everyone killed or save the day, and you don't know which. So I really like that part where essentially you could see him trying to mentor under Kirk in that way without actually, having Kirk as a mentor. He was just like paying attention to everything he did in order to learn how to be a good command officer, if you will.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I think we are done with the bridge crew. So it's time to move on to the recurring characters. They appeared a few times. They don't appear in almost every episode, but they had a significant role in the series and in the movies later, and fans still appreciate them for what they were.
Why don't you start us off with the first one, Soda?
Okay, so the first one that appeared probably the most out of all the repeated characters is Christine Chapel, the main nurse on the Enterprise, as was portrayed by Majel Barrett, who was also Gene Roddenberry's wife.
And do we think that had something to do with her number of scenes?
You mean how few she had or how many she had?
How many she had compared to everyone else?
Well, I don't think she got that many scenes at the end of the day.
Not scenes per se, but I felt like Chapel was more well-rounded as a character.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you know that Chapel's one of the other characters who actually has an episode that is about her, in a way.
Yeah. It's kind of about her. She's the catalyst. Yeah.
It's the first time you see her leave the Enterprise.
True. I think it's the only time we see her leave the Enterprise.
Exactly.
Oh no, she also left in the the episode where Kirk kissed Uhura. She also went with her in she had a scene with Spock or something. Yeah, there were a lot of rumors throughout the years that it was because Majel Barrett was married to Gene Roddenberry. Well, I think at the time she actually had an affair with him, and they married only after the series.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there were a lot of rumors that her relationship with Roddenberry is what brought her all those scenes, basically. She also had a main role in the pilot episode as a character we'll talk about in a minute.
Exactly.
Pike's number one.
So for anyone who didn't notice, yes, that is Christine Chapel and number one are portrayed by the same actress.
Exactly. And she also was the voice of the computer of the ship throughout all the shows until Discovery. And she was also Deanne Troy's mother, Loxana Troy, in The Next Generation. She had a lot of roles in Star Trek throughout the years.
She's one of the reappearing characters in the movies, even if briefly.
Yeah, she appeared in the first movie and the last one, I think, and that's it. I think she's a good actress. I don't think she just got it because of the relationship and that's it. She is a good actress. And the reason they didn't like her in the pilot as the main role was because she was a woman, basically, not because she's a bad actress. So I don't think I think she probably got it because of her relationship with Roddenberry, but she didn't have a lot of other options, basically.
It made a huge difference that, like you said, she was a very good actress because there are a lot of fans of Christine Chapel.
The funny thing is that in the first few years there weren't a lot of fans of her because of her famous crush on Spock, and a lot of fans also had a crush on Spock. And the fandom used to kind of see female characters who are sort of love interests, sort of rivals for their affection for the character.
I mean, I wasn't particularly a fan of her crush on Spock either.
Yeah.
Simply because I just always felt that it would never work out, and therefore I thought, like, oh, honey, don't waste your time on the Vulcan. He just can't reciprocate. It's not going to work.
Yeah. It's definitely not going to work.
I think one of my favorite scenes with her is in For the World is Hollow and I Touch the Sky. Mm. When in the very first part, obviously McCoy's test results have come out with, results that are not good, and she seems to know that his reluctance to tell Kirk, and they have the scene opens with them having an argument, right?
Yeah.
And she's like, basically like, I'll tell him if you won't do it. I always felt there was a lot of undertone to that scene because, one, I think she knew McCoy well enough to know that, if he's the one who's sick, he's going to put off taking care of himself, and she just wasn't going to have it. So I always felt like that was sort of an ode to their relationship, not just as co-workers, but probably as friends. And, she's willing basically to make the hard choice on his behalf because the disease that he had, he would not have much time.
Yeah. I do think
before he did not have a good quality of life. So felt like she was arguing with him, but she was arguing with him in the way that a friend would, looking out for a friend's best interest.
I think I agree with you that this scene had spoke a lot about the relationship, and I also there was another scene with her that I really like in the episode where the gas creature attacks. I think it was the episode that there was this one guy who had trauma from that event or something, and he didn't want to eat. So she brought him like soup or something, and she told him that she would go to McCoy and he would threaten to force feed him or something like that, and that scared him into eating. And I also think that also says something about the relationship, and that she's not afraid about she lied obviously, but she's not afraid of lying a little. To her role and her job as a nurse is very important to her.
She's a very tough nurse, but she does it with the best of interest. She wants to help
Exactly.
people. I mean, just look at the way that she was willing to work, in person with Uhura to help her relearn how to communicate.
Yeah, and I also think that, well, in that regard, she's very much like McCoy himself. They're both kind of tough, but they're sort of tough because they care a
Probably
lot.
one of the Fanon favorites is that Chapel is as scary, if not scarier, than McCoy, and they pretty much, I would say, run the show down in sick
Rule
bay.
it with an iron fist.
Exactly, but they do it with everybody's best interest at heart. So,
and of course, there's her miserable crush on Spock that we started talking about.
and it's not just limited to one episode.
I'm happy that they kind of they didn't like it stretched it out to the movies. We didn't talked about the movies. I think the explanation for this was actually in the animated series. In the animated series, there was an episode that also involved mud. That basically Chapel bought a love potion for mud, and it kind of spread around the Enterprise. And it was a very interesting episode if you compared to every other episode in the animated
this
series.
This is literally like the one of two episodes of the animated series that I've seen.
It's really,
and one is because it had mud in it.
It's very funny. Actually, if anyone listening to this is thinking about maybe watching a few episodes of the animated series, definitely watch this one because it's very, very funny. It has Kirk seducing a rock monster, so but basically after that episode, I think she kind of shook off the crush because it led to very disastrous results in the episode.
Well, if we're talking about her current crush, why don't we talk about her past fiance?
Yeah, that was another weird thing because she actually started crushing on Spock before we realized she had a fiance.
It's What Little Girls Are Made Of, right? The episode where we learned that Chapel had a fiance, Roger, who I believe she thought was dead. And, well, it turns out that he's not.
Yeah.
And also, there's androids.
There are androids, indeed.
To be honest, I always thought that episode was it just seemed a little odd to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because she essentially ends up, discovering Roger's behind, the reason they're there. And
yeah, I think it's a weird episode. It really is. I don't like it very much. I don't think it tells us.
I don't think it did much for her character.
Exactly. I don't think it tells us much about her besides that she had a fiance.
Is there anything else we want to mention about Chapel?
Yeah. She was only mentioned in the new movies, right?
She was a line. Worth a line. In the second movie, Into Darkness, at which apparently Carol Marcus, who is a character in that movie, mentions that she knows about Kirk through Christine Chapel. There's some sort of insinuation that Chapel and Kirk basically knew each other.
So
how do
Chapel
I put this?
Is a in both the original series and the new movie.
Well, Kirk was portrayed as being sort of a one night stand kind of guy, and Chapel was one of those. So, But she's literally was a throwaway line in that movie, which is sad because she's only referenced in connection with having been with Kirk. And I think that made a lot of fans upset because Chapel's obviously more well established in the original series.
She's more established than Carol, actually.
By far. In Fanon, at least, they've recreated Christine Chapel in Abrams' verse, and she's just as, tough as she is in the original series, and it's pretty awesome. I would say if there's one character I had wanted who had been left out of Abrams' verse canon that I'd wanted to see, it would have been her.
Also, she became actually a doctor in the movies, in the original series movies. Yes, stopped being just a nurse.
And she also had darker hair.
I think that just made her natural hair.
Yeah, it was. But she wasn't a blonde anymore. Well, I think that leads us to someone else who had a crush. Yeah. And her name is Janice Rand. She is a yeoman to Kirk. And in actual canon, she was very young. She's actually about the age of Chekov, I would say. And her stint on the Enterprise is actually short-lived. Yeah. Because from what I know, she's not even what is she there, like maybe a year or less before she is transferred?
Well, in the original, she was there for 5 episodes in total.
Right, 5 episodes in total, and then supposedly transferred off the Enterprise. And in those 5 episodes, I think the reason she was most remembered is because she obviously had this huge crush on Captain James T. Kirk.
And it was actually sort of reciprocated, right? It wasn't just one-sided, but it was... Rand is interesting, I think, because of her potential as a character. Like, when they created the character, you could see from looking at the episode she was in that they had more plans for the future, but real life got in the way. And she had this, in every episode she was in, there was this will they, won't they bit with Kirk and her. They're probably going to stretch it out throughout the series if she had gotten to stay.
I have to say, I also felt like there was a bit of awkwardness in her crush. Not as awkward, obviously, as Chapel with Spock, but in the fact that she was young, yeoman to Kirk. Kirk didn't actually sleep around on the Enterprise. So I always felt like he was aware of her crush on him. I think for me it was the episode Miri, where he finally addressed the fact that she had this crush on him, and he could not reciprocate.
But
it's almost like it was I can't remember. I think that was the final episode she was in, wasn't it?
No, I think no. I think there was another episode. I can't remember his name. Yeah, I think
there's one more. But Miri was the one where she was most...
I think the episode she was most prominent in was the one with the 2 Kirks.
That's because one of the Kirks was literally harassing her.
It was. I think later in the novels they kind of wrote in that was the reason she left the Enterprise, that she couldn't stay on the ship after the harassment, even though she knew it wasn't really Kirk. It still kind of traumatized her. And she stayed in Starfleet. We saw her again in the first movie. Yeah.
We did, actually. That's a good point. But back to Miri, that's the one where she basically tells Kirk, in the most awkward way possible, I want you to look at my legs. I mean, what? And of course, Kirk is more concerned with making sure they all survive.
Yeah.
I guess you could say that was the episode where she reached the pinnacle of jealousy.
Yeah, and it was very awkward because she was essentially competing with a child.
A child, right. Kirk was almost like, no, this is not the time or the place, human. And so
I think
I felt her crush was a little cringeworthy.
I think it didn't really have a place in the show, and if it had stayed, it would have given the show a very different feeling. I think you can see in other episodes that there were roles that were written with her in mind but had to be changed again because of life circumstances. So, for example, in the Square of Gothos, I think
Yes.
it was very obvious that Rand was supposed to be the yeoman that Kirk and the Q child, the demigod, were fighting about. So I think it's kind of interesting to think sometimes about what would have happened if she was in the series. And I'm like, the actress had to leave because of very unfortunate circumstances. And but at the end of the day, I
Right.
think the series was better off without her character.
It would have been too much to have a reoccurring
Yeah.
love interest for Kirk. Um, he was better suited to being the captain that could never have the permanent love interest because he was committed to his
Yeah,
career.
and I think, like you said, whenever it was like shoved into the episode, it was kind of awkward. Oh, I remember the last episode she was in, Balance of Terror, I think. Yeah, she had this very, very awkward scene with Kirk when they just see the Romulans and they just kind of start hugging each other on the bridge for no reason. And like, yeah,
No.
and like, it's very, very
Yeah.
weird.
I think I had erased that from my
I
mind.
remember it because when I first showed it to a friend of mine who've never seen any other episode before, and like she got the characters very quickly, but then that scene was basically the first scene Randy's shown in the episode, and she was like, "Who is that? And why is she hugging the captain all of a sudden?" It's just very awkward. Yeah.
It is very awkward. Well, there's nothing to mention here about her in Abrams' verse because she's not in it. Honestly, I don't know how they could have brought her in, knowing that her primary role in the original series was to be
Like,
the one with the crush on Kirk, the potential love interest, because they had already slated that for Carol Marcus in the second movie. And then, of course, thank goodness they take out all the love interest plots for the
yeah.
third movie because they really have no place in that type of action. The next one on the list, Soda, I don't know very well, so I'm going to let you talk about them.
I'll be honest, they are not that. They don't have really big roles. We're talking about Mres and Arex or Arex of the animated series. Basically, in the animated series, the actor of Chekov wasn't available, so they didn't have him as a character. So instead, they added two alien characters, which were easier to add to an animated series because they were drawn. They didn't have to be like people in bed suits. So you had Mres, who was this lion-esque alien. She looked like a lion, basically.
Oh,
And
I can add something here. She is a what's her species name? Something like a cat. I have to look it up because it's mentioned in the Abrams verse. But go ahead.
and Arex is an alien that, well, we never actually learn about his species. And when Discovery came out, a lot of people theorized that Saru from Discovery is the same species as Arex. I'm not sure how his name is pronounced. And but the Discovery showrunners basically ruled it out.
Aha. Okay, Acacian.
Occasion.
Okay, so Lieutenant Mires is Acacian, and the reason this sticks out to me because in the opening scene of Into Darkness,
Mhm.
it looks like Kirk is in bed with two Cations.
Okay.
So, because you can see they have tails.
Okay.
They basically look like Mires.
Interesting.
Yes, it's again another one of those throwaways, except it's not in a line. It's he answers his comms like jumping out of bed, and you see that he's got two females in it.
I think her species made an appearance in one of the movies. I think the first movie in the large crowd scene. I think there were a few of those.
Yeah,
Um,
I always thought maybe there was one of them in that the planet, the outpost, and she was dancing on the table.
Maybe she was also one of them. I don't know.
She was one of them because she had a tail and she was like in a cat suit practically.
Yeah, it's possible. But I don't remember Mres having like 3 breasts or something like that. Yeah.
Well, I always thought she looked very much like them.
It's possible they're the same species. It's not. But basically, we don't learn that much about them in the animated series to replace Chekov, but they are part of the bridge crew of the animated series. So it's interesting that we have other alien bridge crew except for Spock in the animated series.
Did you notice that there were more alien species in the animated series than the original series? At least as far as Starfleet officers. I feel like, probably that was because it's easier to draw them than it is to pay to dress up actors and the way that they had to dress Spock up every day.
Basically.
Or dress Nimoy up as Spock. Is there anything that really stood out to you about these two?
Besides the point about Saru and Arex, not really. I think it was kind of hinted in one episode that Mres and Scotty might be interested in one another, but it was kind of dismissed. I think it was the love potion episode that was kind of...
that is one thing we forgot to mention, and that's Scotty has a love interest in the original series for an episode. Her name's Mira Romaine.
Yeah.
And then in the movies, it almost looks like Scotty and Uhura are interested in each other.
And they are a popular ship in the original series fandom.
Yes, they are. So I think it's time to talk about probably our our favorite repeat appearances.
Yeah.
At least, some of my favorite. And that is, we're going to do them as a pair. That's Saavik and Amanda.
Yeah. Saavik and Amanda. Basically, Spock's parents. Yep, they are recurring characters. They're famous characters. They even appear. Well, Saavik also appears in The Next Generation, and both him and Amanda appear in Discovery.
Well, what to say here? The episode that Journey to Babel that you first meet Saavik and Amanda, hands down one of my favorite. And primarily because Saavik and Amanda are just so cute together, which is probably odd to say for a Vulcan human couple that are supposed to be very dignified. I think you just get the sense as Saavik is leading his wife around the ship that they're both very happy in their relationship. And
I think what you can see when you look at their relationship is that they found the balance between their two worlds.
And and so if you ever did wonder how is it that a Vulcan and a human could romantically be together, well, here's your answer. Because clearly, however long it's taken for them to work out the kinks of their relationship, they have or at least that, or they're very good at presenting united front, even when they're arguing.
Exactly.
which is just adorable. You can see that Amanda, even if she seems more reserved for a human, probably having to being the wife of an ambassador like Saavik, she's still unrepentantly human when she wants to be.
Exactly. Even though I think, she did seem to make a lot of sacrifices for Saavik. She moved to Vulcan. She raised her child to be Vulcan, etc., etc. But I think like the show doesn't present it as like she resents him for it. Like he asked her and she agreed to it.
And it also presents it like she didn't have to change who she was.
Exactly.
At the core of her to be a wife of a Vulcan.
It seems like she genuinely respects Vulcan culture, and she basically just wants to do justice to it. She tries to adopt it as much as she can.
So how about we talk about Saavik and Amanda separately as a parent to Spock? How was it portrayed in the original series? Well, my impression for Saavik and Spock as father and son is that there is some distance there.
Yeah, they haven't spoken to each other in 20 years.
It's very formal, and so you can see why Amanda, being in that episode is actually a boon to the overall plot, because she is sort of like the go-between
Yeah.
between Sark and Spock, who clearly have not communicated, or not good at communicating with each other, even though they're very, very much alike. She's sort of the bridge between them, which brings me to Amanda as the mother of Spock. Here, I think I really adore her characterization. She knew how to tease him as his mother without offending him in the fact that he's a Vulcan. Like,
Yeah.
clearly he has a great respect for his mother, and she a great respect for her son. But you could see the familial touch there, whereas you didn't necessarily see that between Sarek and Spock.
Yeah, I think in the animated series, Kid Spock basically said that while he loves his mother, she kind of confuses him because he's constantly told to act more Vulcan, but on the other hand, his mother is not exactly setting an example because she acts human. So I think there's some sort of conflicting emotions here, because on one hand he loves his mother, of course he loves his mother, but on the other hand he also feels like she kind of she is the reason he's not the perfect Vulcan he wants
Fully
to be.
Vulcan.
Basically, he's not the Vulcan he wants to be.
You can see this confirmed in the fourth movie, I think. Is it the fourth? It's the one after the search for Spock.
Yeah.
Or is it in the search for Spock? I can't. Basically, where Spock is returned, as we'll say, and he is going through his education.
Yeah.
And you have the scene where Amanda is with him, and she's actually encouraging him to listen to his feelings.
Yeah.
So that for me is just another example of how she was like, you may be my Vulcan son, but half of you is still like me. And don't necessarily ignore that half.
Yeah. I think this was more of a, I think it's why it's like the conclusion Sarek and Amanda came to maybe after Spock died and came back to life, because I think in the original series and the animated series, you can kind of tell that they were both kind of in agreement that they should raise him as Vulcan. But maybe after he died and came back to life, they kind of realized that sort of ruined our relationship with our son. Maybe we should try to respect his human side more.
Well, even Spock was already becoming, before he died, was almost to the point of accepting that he was his human half, if you will. He had tried to go through the purging of emotions and couldn't do it. And then thereafter, after his rebirth, if you will, he is more relaxed than than he is at any other point, any other time before that. So I agree with you. They probably did realize we just should accept our son for who he is, and if that means accepting him being a little less Vulcan and a little more human at times, so be it.
Yeah.
It's pretty much as you would hope, a conclusion any parent comes to, that you don't necessarily force your children to be one way or the other. You just accept who they become.
Exactly.
As long as they're essentially good people.
Yeah. What about Sarek and Amanda in the new series, the new movies?
Amanda's appearance, played by Winona Ryder, is very brief in the first movie because she dies. But you can see in those moments how close she was to Spock. I mean, it devastates Spock. Clearly that his mother, he's not able to save his mother, before Vulcan is wiped out. So we don't actually get to know a whole lot about Amanda in Abrams' verse, other than the fact that, Spock cared for her deeply, and it affects him long term having to lose her that way. The one character we do get a little more insight into is Sarek. We see Sarek, of course, as the grieving husband after, Amanda could not be saved. But that grief almost seems to soften the way in which he communicates with his son. He's very upfront with Spock about his relationship with Amanda. I mean, Spock asked him almost like, why did you marry her? And he says, well, I loved her. I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't really imagine the Sarek of the original series saying that to his son.
Probably not.
So you don't really see much of him after that point. I mean, Sarek is more prominent in the first movie because he's on board the Enterprise while they're trying to face Nero, because the surviving Vulcans were beamed aboard to the Enterprise. He's sort of a constraint on his son when, Spock finally is shown to be emotionally compromised by the death of his mother and the death of the whole planet. The one who reels him in is Sarek. There's a brief scene in the very beginning where it shows birth of Spock. There's practically no dialogue in that scene. It's just like she's holding up baby Spock to hand to her husband, and he's got little pointed ears, and it's sort of like ears, and it's just sort of sets the tone for the movie. And then you have a childhood scene with Spock where he's being bullied essentially by some of the other children while they're all being educated, sort of like a school scenario. The one who talks to him is his father. So I find that interesting as well. Clearly, you see Spock loved his mother, but it also seems like maybe Spock communicated a little more freely with his father. I don't know. I might be making inferences there because we don't have too much to go on.
Yeah.
So it's a shame we didn't have more of them. I mean, I thought it was quite about Discovery.
In Discovery, they both appear. I don't want to get to spoilery territory. Also, I'm behind on a few episodes, but they still seem to have a bit of a more tense relationship in Discovery than in the original series. I mean, it's possibly due to the time period that has passed. Discovery is 10 years before the original series, but they really do seem to be more like less in agreement about how they want to raise their children and so on. So it's an interesting take. It's interesting to see.
Well, it also makes more sense. I mean, they're earlier on in their marriage.
Yeah, they do. They are. Though, it's only 10 years before the original series. Spock is already an adult and everything. Also, they have more children to consider in the Discovery. I think it's an interesting point because we really didn't see that much conflict between them in the original series, which probably was there at some point because they are from two completely different cultures. And I think, I don't believe Spock really was the first Vulcan human child, but they weren't very common, I believe. So they really were kind of charting their own territory. Like, they didn't have much to rely on.
So in the way that Sarek was sort of was the one to give advice to his son and to comfort his son when he was grieving in Abrams' verse, what is Sarek like with respect to Spock in Discovery? Is he that type of parent?
No.
Or is he more in keeping with the original series?
Well, in some regards in Discovery, I think he's actually tougher on Spock. But he is also nicer to Michael than you would expect him to be. So,
having seen the first episode, I agree with that statement. It was surprising.
It's not surprising. So on one hand, it's not like being tough is not his parenting style, apparently. It's just his relationship with Spock is very tense.
Well, what about Amanda then?
Well, we see more of Amanda in the second season, and like I said, I'm a few episodes behind, but she's basically, she's nice. She's kind of the character you'd expect her to be. She's very understanding, very open. She is very protective of Spock. I think you could get that a little in Journey to Babel in the original series, that she was very upset about all the bullying he was going through.
Mm-hmm. So, do you think that you would say the Discovery portrayals of Sarek and Amanda is pretty much in keeping with how they were established in the original series? Even though it's expounded upon.
As parents, I think they are, but as a couple, I think they are a more. a more cohesive couple in the original series than they are in Discovery, and I don't know. It just feels like It feels like Amanda might have more resentment to Saavik about certain things in Discovery than in the original series.
Mm-hmm. There again, I mean, you could say that's because of the point they are in their marriage. So obviously they've been together a very long time by the time you see them in Journey to Babel.
Yeah, but also again because I don't want to get into spoiler territory, but the events of the second season are very trying.
Yes.
For the family.
Well, shall we talk about the last two minor reoccurring characters?
Yeah, I added them in because I think that in the first season of the original series, there was this intention to make like a lot of small characters, like a very like their own characters. You would see them in the background and you would recognize this guy, this is that guy. Like they wouldn't all be like interchangeable, which I think is what happened in the second and third season. That only the really main bridge crew remained constant, but the other characters kind of switched around. So the two, I think, the most prominent ones are Kevin Riley and DeSalle, which I remember distinctly both of them being called by name in at least 2 episodes.
So if we start with DeSalle, wasn't he the navigator in place of Chekov?
Yeah,
first time we see him. It's prior to Chekov joining the crew, I think.
Yes, I think he was. It's possible that before they decided on a Russian guy, they thought maybe a French guy would be the navigator. Again, keeping with the crew of different ethnicities.
Well, unfortunately, they didn't portray him as very French. I mean, he didn't have many lines at all.
Yeah. Also, when he spoke, he didn't have like a very prominent French accent, so that's a plus, I think. And I think, you know what, Kevin Riley, when you think about it, Chekov is kind of like a combination of DeSalle and Kevin Riley, because Kevin Riley was also this very young crew member. He's best remembered as the guy that wouldn't stop singing in the naked time. And he's also the guy that was another survivor of Kodos besides Kirk.
Yeah, again, sort of a young, impetuous officer.
Yeah.
His singing was hilarious.
That's true.
I mean, I don't know, it just cracked me up. But, I mean, he was supposed to have been young enough to barely even remember Kodos.
Yes.
And yet, obviously, you know, he was still very affected by it.
I think in the episode it was hinted that his family died because of Kodos.
As a young, impetuous officer would, who sees a chance to avenge his family, he does essentially what Kirk kind of feels like he wants to do, but he doesn't have the restraint that Kirk does.
Yeah.
Which I found very interesting, you know, reflection of Kirk's character.
Yeah. Again, I think that Sal and Kevin Riley were basically the prototypes for Chekov.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah.
So that leads us to characters who did not necessarily have a lot of screen presence in the original series or the movies, or perhaps they were just in one movie, but they have sort of a presence in the fandom.
Yeah.
Because fans seem to really
resonate with them. Yeah.
Yes, essentially invigorate their characterization. The first one on the list, I think, is probably my Fanon favorite. And that is Captain Christopher Pike. In the original series, like you said, the pilot, I mean, this is really the first time you would have seen Pike was in the pilot, but they didn't air it till later. And that is actually a pre-Kirk captaincy episode. So Christopher Pike is in charge, and you see his first officer is number one, and you see that Spock is actually science officer under Pike, and it's a little disjointed, the whole episode.
Yeah. It was a little, half-baked before they decided on the characterization.
You kind of have to draw a lot of inferences about who Pike was as a captain. At first, you might think he seems similar to Kirk, maybe a little more seasoned, a little more strict when it comes to the rules. But I think for me, Captain Pike was not really fleshed out as sort of a a character we could appreciate until Abrams verse. And then he sort of blew up because you had Bruce Greenwood portray Christopher Pike in Abrams verse, and he was integral to the first and second movie,
Mm-hmm.
and essentially became sort of like the father figure to Kirk. So you really got more of a sense of what kind of captain Pike was, and that is he's someone who understands Kirk's need to be a little reckless and gamble on his decisions and whatnot. And he thinks part of that does make a good captain, but his natural inclination is to be by the rules kind of guy from day to day. So he's like, there's a hint of he might have been more like a Kirk when he was younger, but he's been a captain for a while. He's a very seasoned officer. He's seen a lot of dangerous, life-threatening situations, and with that experience comes a maturity that essentially makes him a great captain and a respected captain. And then, so essentially, it's not much of a stretch that after the first Abrams movie, he then becomes an admiral and sort of takes up more of a mentoring position for Kirk. He's the one who challenges Jim not only to do his best and try to go above and beyond everybody's expectations, but he essentially tells Kirk, you're young, but I believe in you, and you will be a good captain. You just got to work for it. And he's also not afraid to call Kirk out on his when he's being far too reckless or just having no regard for the rules at all. As we know in the original series, that Kirk, I mean, he did respect the rules. He just also knew how to bend them when the situation called for it.
It's interesting because, according to what you're saying, his role in the new movies is like in the first episode, in the pilot episode, he was this kind of brooding guy, you know. He seemed like a good captain, but he was more he was less social than Kirk. Kirk was very friendly and open to his crew members,
Yeah.
and Spike was like this distant kind of captain, or at least so he seemed in the pilot episode. But then we discovered that he and Spock very in the menagerie. We basically discovered that Spock thinks very highly of him, basically, to the point that he made him such a big promise, you know, to return him. Yeah. And
Exactly.
then in Discovery, well, in the second season of Discovery, Pike is actually the captain of Discovery, and he's not exactly as we see him in the pilot. He's He's a lot more of a classic captain, I'd say. Very friendly, very moral. You know, he cares a lot about his crew, etc., etc., and he does really care about Spock. So it kind of sounds like the movies kind of reverse these roles. That in the movies, Pike is this mentor for Kirk, but in Discovery, Pike is this kind of mentor for Spock.
When I heard that they were going to have Pike in Discovery, my first thought was, oh, are they going to play off of Christopher Pike from Abrams' verse, because that Christopher Pike was very much well received by fans. And so it doesn't surprise me to hear that that's sort of the case. Like you said, you see more of your classic captain in Christopher Pike in Discovery, just as you do in the Abrams verse. But he's also sort of an approachable guy who, you know, not only performs based on his own moral code, if you will, but he's open enough to have a close relationship with his crew. And like you said, for Discovery, it's Spock, and then of course in the Abrams verse, he treats Kirk almost like a son. That sounds like a good thing to me, because I think Greenwood's portrayal was far better than probably anything they put on the actual script.
When it comes to Pike, from what I've seen, basically Pike in Discovery is very well received among fans. But a lot of people do say, well, I was afraid because I hoped that they'll take the actor from the movies to portray him in the series, and they didn't do that, and I was worried that the actor that they did end up taking for the series wouldn't do as good of a job, but I'm pleasantly surprised. He does a very good job. And yeah, basically the character is very well received. A lot of people like him as the captain.
You're telling me that there was an expectation that they wanted Pike to be like the
Yeah,
Abrams
I think a lot of
version.
fans like Pike in the Abrams verse.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all. Obviously, it would have been a stretch to have Bruce Greenwood actually act in the TV series, but I'm glad to hear that it's Anson Mount, right? That Anson Mount actually does something just as good with Pike. I don't know what it is about this character. In the original series, Christopher Pike wasn't exactly a standout performance. We only did see him in 2 episodes, and like you said, he seemed more brooding and sort of. He was also kind of aggressive. And that as well, the point at which people really became interested in the character was obviously in the Abrams verse, and it's good to see that that interest has continued after the movies and has sort of had an overlap into Discovery.
I think also in the pilot episode, he was also a little bit prejudiced. Like he had this line about how he's not used to having women on the bridge or something like that. That was very different. I think a lot of fans of like,
Yeah.
that's we let's all pretend this line wasn't really said.
Well, but how could he feel that way if
I
he
mean, how could
had
it
a
feel
woman as his
that
first
way? There
officer?
were female captains in Starfleet all this time. It's just a product of the time.
So if I ever think of Christopher Pike, I obviously go straight to the Abrams verse portrayal. He's featured a lot in Fanon, even though, spoiler alert, he does die in Into Darkness, which is a really big travesty. Most people pretend that never happened. Becomes sort of basically a repeat appearance in fan fiction, because there was clearly not enough of him in the movies, and then they axed his character. What are people to do but bring him back to life? I think he will continue to be a fan favorite going forward, and it's good to hear that he's going to be, and is a fan favorite now in Discovery as well. So
Pike lives. Yeah, that's
end.
basically how you can sum his character track up until now. Pike lives. Another character who's like Fanon Favorite, despite only having one appearance basically in one episode, is Dr. Mbenga.
Remind me what episode that was, because even though I adore this fan favorite character, I hardly remember his appearance at all in the series.
I remember Spock had some sort of, I think he was sick or something, and Mbenga basically diagnosed him. Mbenga was a doctor who studied on Vulcan. He knows about Vulcan medicine more than anyone else in the med bay, apparently. I heard this theory that he was specifically hired after the events of Amok Time, where Spock was plagued by a weird Vulcan thing and no one knew what to do about it. So they realized that maybe if they have a Vulcan crew member, they need a doctor who understands Vulcan medicine to take care of him.
This is another one I think is, very prominent in Fanon. And that's because he, like you said, he is in fact sort of the expert on Vulcan physiology. And since we know our resident Vulcan Spock is so tight-lipped about anything that has to do with him and how he functions, it's good to have someone aboard who can actually make sense of those readings that Dr. McCoy just says are, you'd be dead if you were human. Well, great. What does that actually mean for Spock, though? So I think one of my favorite theories in Fanon is that McCoy actually recruits Mbenga because Mbenga is sort of an expert on Vulcan physiology, because he took time to study on Vulcan.
Yeah, this seems to make sense. Also, I think he's a popular character because he kind of fleshes out the med bay, because we don't actually know that much about who works in the med bay besides McCoy and Chapel.
You sure it wasn't just McCoy and Chapel? Because that's pretty much all I ever saw. I thought they just ran it, the two of them.
I'm pretty sure there was even another doctor mentioned at some point, but we never saw him. I think it was called Rodriguez or something. Yeah, basically because he helps flesh out the med bay, and it's interesting if we need to talk to a doctor, and like maybe if McCoy needs someone to consult with or something. It's good to have a second opinion.
Mm-hmm. And also, well, you would expect for a crew of that size that Dr. McCoy would not be the only doctor aboard. That, you know, he may be the chief medical officer, but surely he has a staff of doctors and nurses. And so here is an example of another physician on board that's part of his staff. So, like you said, it fleshes out the fact that sick bay actually is a full department and is probably staffed like one.
That's basically all I have to say about the bank.
The actor who played him in that appearance in the original series, he was not one of the regular actors, was he? So, for instance, it made me think of Daystrom, right? So the Daystrom actor actually appeared a couple of times in the series in different roles.
Maybe he was. I mean, I don't remember very well all the actors that were recast, in several roles. I don't remember him appearing as someone else. Maybe he was.
Basically, he's a fan favorite. That adds to the sick bay. Makes it a trio, right? McCoy, Chapel, and Benga. I'm going to let you take the next one, Soda.
Talking about Saavik, the Vulcan up-and-coming Starfleet officer in the Academy in the second movie. Does she graduate by the third movie? I actually don't remember.
I'm honestly not sure.
Yeah, basically I think she's like in the second movie, wasn't it like her graduation exam or something like that?
I was looking something up, so just to go back on M'Benga real quick, he appeared in 2 episodes.
Mm-hmm.
A Private Little War and That Which Survives.
Yeah. Oh, in A Private Little War is Spock shot, so makes sense that he was looking him up.
But back to Saavik. I think I remember her more as when Kirstie Alley played her. And
she only appeared in 2 movies, in the second and the third movie, and Kirstie Alley really did a great job in acting, playing her. In the second movie, she was a very memorable character. She was also a fan favorite, for a long time. Basically, she's a student that Spock kind of takes under his wing, and they have this little Vulcan jokes between them about humans and their human ways. And they kind of, talk in Vulcan about humans behind their back. A little. It really is accepted because she was a fan favorite character. The fanon about her from the novels became kind of, and because she wasn't portrayed beyond that, which is honestly I'm kind of surprised because she was a popular character. But they don't talk about her in the Abrams movies, for example. I know she doesn't appear in the Abrams movies.
No, she doesn't. You know what is more interesting to me? How her relationship changes in The Search for Spock. When Rebirth Spock is about to go through the Pon farr. And then I think later on in some novelization, she's supposed to be his wife.
I think it was kind of mentioned by Leonard Nimoy, that one of the possible endings of one of the possible beginnings of the 4th movie, were that Saavik had to stay behind because she was pregnant with Spock's child. And he said he ended up saying he cut it out because he didn't think it was fitting. And I'm really happy with this decision. I think it's very weird. Because they're also because of the age difference, but also because he's her mentor and her teacher, and it just doesn't seem right,
I think that for me was, I think I was fine with her up until that point, and then I thought, well, this is just awkward. Even though technically, for her, she would remember it, but it's very unlikely that when Spock was returned to his normal self, that he's got much, if any, memory of that.
He was also, you remember the other man student that Spock had in the 6th movie? The Vulcan girl that ended up betraying him?
Yes, the one who did betray him. It was played by,
I don't even remember.
I can't call her name, but she was a Sex and the City
I don't remember
actress.
The name of her character either, but I think she was also supposed to be Saavik originally. But I can't remember why they eventually didn't go with Saavik. I think it was because none of the actresses were available, and also maybe maybe Nimoy thought it wasn't fair to her character or something, so they chose to make her a completely new character.
Which, I'm going to be honest with you, Soda, I think that confused a lot of people. I think maybe they were expecting to see Saavik, and then to have this new officer who then eventually turns out to be a traitor.
Yeah, I think it really is kind of confusing because it's basically she introduces this character out of nowhere.
Is there anything else we need to discuss with Saavik?
Well, I just think it's weird that she wasn't in the new movies because she's kind of a popular character.
I'm not. The new movies are set so early on in the original series. You know, they've just come together as a bridge crew, that there's really no room for Saavik there, because Spock is not going to be mentoring somebody at that point in his career when he's barely been first officer of the Enterprise for not even a full 5-year mission. Plus, so if Saavik had been there, one, she probably would have been very young. Probably too young to even be on the ship. And two, Spock is at a crossroads in kind of all 3 movies, in which he's just trying to figure out what he wants for himself and sort of who he is. You know, more Vulcan, more human. He's in a relationship with a human. His people are practically or basically endangered species now, and should he even be in Starfleet? He has so much going on with his character that he's not in any position to advise someone on their future, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, I can get it, but aside from the new movies, I also think it's weird that she didn't make an appearance or even was mentioned in any of the other Star Trek series. Like, The Next Generation seems like a good fit for her, or Deep Space Nine even, or Voyager.
Oh, like, yeah.
She, aside from the movies, she really wasn't even mentioned any other place, so it is kind of weird to me. Yeah, because again, she was popular. She was very popular. So it's weird.
Okay, well, let's move on to the next one, which is Gary Mitchell.
Yeah, we talked about him a little in the villains episode.
Oh, we did. We did talk about him, especially as one of the more popular villains, just for the fact that he was probably your typical Turian Starfleet officer, happened to be a best friend to Kirk, and then was given godlike powers and went off the rails. So I think Gary Mitchell in particular is a Fanon favorite, not just like from the perspective of being a villain, but just as a character himself, because he was portrayed as sort of a best friend to Kirk that we never really knew or never had a chance to know. So it just raises all these questions of how long did Kirk know this guy? You know, just were they really best friends? Would he have been closer to Mitchell if Mitchell had lived than, say, perhaps he would have been to Spock? It just raises a bunch of questions about potentially what could have been, as opposed to what actually happened in the series once Mitchell was destroyed.
Yeah, I also think I know he had more appearances in like comics, in Star Trek comics, especially ones that looked into Kirk's past because they were friends from the Academy.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I think you're right. He's mostly popular because of his relationship with Kirk, and that we didn't really get to see actually, because most of what we got of him was him as a villain.
It makes it really interesting for Abrams verse because McCoy was supposed to be the best friend of Kirk during the Academy. Yet, if you go and look if you look at the Star Trek ongoing comic series that supported the rebooted movies, Gary Mitchell is in them, almost in one of the first couple of issues. And again, they just kind of rehashed the whole episode with the godlike powers and whatnot with Mitchell. But you see Kirk talking to Mitchell in a way that indicates they were very good friends at the Academy. So they didn't exactly do anything different with him for the backstory in the rebooted movies. Probably a good thing they didn't actually have him as a fleshed out character in Abrams' verse, because he would have been sort of a competitor for McCoy.
Yeah, I think it's one of the limitations that when you adapt some episodic, like a TV series, into a movie, you have to kind of cut down on characters and plot lines and things like that. So it is probably for the best that his spot was taken by McCoy, because from what you've told me, McCoy didn't have that big of a role in the movie to begin with.
And no, he didn't. So how sad would it have been if he'd been replaced by Mitchell? I don't really have much more to add here about him.
Yeah, I think we should move on.
Okay. Second to last that we're going to talk about in favorites in Fanon. This is Chief Security, Giotto. Well, let's just say he's pretty much the only head of security that I've ever heard of in the original series.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I wrote him down, because the position of the chief of security became like very prominent in the following Star Trek series. But in the original series, he literally was the only one, and he only appeared in one episode.
What do you do in Fanon when you basically need to reference a chief of security? I mean, he's clearly going to be a member of the senior officers club. He's running a whole department, so just who is this person? And I think a lot of people have made use of that, like, one appearance character.
That's all we have. There isn't that much to talk about. He seems like a competent guy. You know, he's not very rash or anything like that. He really doesn't make much of an impression as a character.
Interesting, in Abrams' verse, there's this character in the beginning of the first movie where Kirk is in the bar fight before he gets recruited to Starfleet. And the guy he's in the bar fight with is called Hendorf, this kind of like this bully, you know, this new cadet who's kind of a bully. Well, he pounds on Kirk because Kirk can't seem to fight very well. He gets beat up. But later, well, and mainly it's because Kirk, you know, calls him Cupcake and, you know, picks a fight with him. I think Hendorf, the character who plays Hendorf, he's a cadet in that, and then later on I think he's maybe an officer on the Enterprise, and obviously he's in a red shirt, and so I don't know if it's actually mentioned in the movies, but in the comics for sure he's a security officer, and he may actually be Kirk's chief of security. So the guy that he originally clashed with and called Cupcake actually turns out to be an officer who works for Kirk, and they eventually get over that. Although I have to say, I'd be very embarrassed to work for the guy that I punched in the face. But in Abrams' verse, there really is no defined chief of security in any of the movies. You kind of have to dig around in the comics to even find a mention of that. I have one question, Soda. Who mans the weapons station, if not someone in security? Because it always seemed like they kind of played Russian roulette with the weapons station. Like, it could be Chekov at one point, it could be Scotty at one point. Whoever was nearest to the station was you know, shooting the missiles.
Well, the one person I distinctly remember was in Bounce of Terror, when there was this couple that was about to marry. They were manning the weapons station, basically. And after them, that guy that was suspicious of Spock also manned the weapons station.
So I always wondered why your chief of security was never present on the bridge ever. Why is it some of your other senior officers were there, and even McCoy, who really shouldn't have been on the bridge?
Yeah, I think it was part of maybe Roddenberry's vision of like a utopian future with less violence, that like the security and the weapons department were kind of downplayed.
And yet very much needed, because they were always running into trouble.
Yeah, but actually they weren't used that much. The weapons and stuff. I mean, the red shirts were used a lot and died a lot. We all know that, but
that's what I meant. They, you know, they're always their standard part of, like, you know, the landing party.
Yeah, but it's very ineffectual. Maybe that's why the chief of security rose to prominence, because they saw that without a very strict chief, they couldn't really run them very well.
Maybe they could never keep the position filled because it was so dangerous to be in security.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that's enough about him. The last one, you go, Soda.
Yep, that's David Marcus, Captain Kirk's son. He appeared in 2 movies, along with Saavik. In the second movie, The Wrath of Khan, and in the third movie, The Search for Spock, where he also died. I'm guessing that in the new movies, because Carol Marcus did appear in the second one, right?
Yes, but that was when she first meets Kirk.
I guess they kind of were sowing the seeds
Yes.
for the future or something like that.
You know, Carol Marcus, she leaves the crew sometime between Into Darkness and Beyond. She's not actually in Beyond, so she's moved on, I think, to probably continue the work on the program that she started with her father, Admiral Alexander Marcus. And I wouldn't be shocked if that program or project is very similar to the same one that is in the original series. The Genesis. Yeah,
Genesis.
that wouldn't surprise me at all.
So David spent most of his life not knowing that Kirk was his father. Kirk and Carol had this agreement that because they wanted to go into basically different lives, they wouldn't be together and they wouldn't raise the kid together. And Kirk agreed not to be part of the kid's life, which is why Carol also didn't tell David about him. And also, she didn't want David to follow in his father's footsteps and be this hero that goes on very dangerous missions.
I have a lot of opinions about that, but it's probably not relevant here.
Well, you can say your opinions. This is why we have a podcast.
Oh, you mean that's not the way to parent your child? By telling, not letting them make their own choices? Anyway, well, what I find interesting is that he is characterized as someone who seems to have a real interest in Genesis and science in general that his mother does. So it always made me wonder if, had he been a part of Starfleet and whatnot, if he would have actually followed in his father's footsteps, or if he would have been more of continued to be a scientist as opposed to someone who inevitably wanted to captain a ship.
It is a very interesting thing to think about. I mean, I think the third movie also makes kind of a case about how he is kind of like Kirk in the sense that he will put himself first even in the face of danger to protect other people. Basically, he really is kind of like, he does tend to put himself in risks.
It does get him killed.
Yeah, so maybe his mother at a point,
Mm-hmm.
But, I think...
It could be argued at the end of the day that kind of willingness to sacrifice for others is like what is at the core of a Starfleet officer. I mean, because they're out there in the face of risk to, for the betterment of society itself. So.
Yeah, but I don't know if it means that he would actually captain the ship. That's true. Well, Kirk and Carol agreed to it. So it's not like she physically prevented Kirk from coming.
So, do you feel like there was any regret on Kirk's part?
I think it's very obvious that there was some kind of regret. After David died, it's very obvious that Kirk felt guilty. Not only because he thinks he caused it, but also because he probably feels he could have gotten to know him, and he didn't really have the chance to do it.
Do you know creatively why they decided to do that?
I actually don't know.
Well, then I'm just going to assume it was like Abrams in Into Darkness when he killed Pike. It was for... it was just to muddy the emotional waters with the Kirks.
Maybe, yeah. I guess it was kind of a one-for-one scenario, like you can regain Spock, but you lose your son.
Well, that's not a nice message.
Well, yeah, if you ever end up in a situation you can return someone from the dead, maybe it's not a very nice situation.
That there has to be a sacrifice no matter what?
I guess.
So, what about David's short-lived relationship with Saavik?
It was kind of I feel like it was kind of hinted that they had like this romantic potential.
Yes, I agree. Which is why I thought it was even more awkward that she had to explain to David about Spock's Ponfar.
Yeah.
They'd be like, well, you're just going to have to step out of this cave now. Because I have to take care of this. Even though we seem to have we seem to have this attraction between us.
Yeah, that was a very odd choice of script of, I don't know, whoever decided to put the scene in. It was very weird. Yeah, I think basically the most prominent thing about David is Kirk's guilt about not actually getting to know him and having a relationship
And
with
then
him.
probably Carol's guilt in trying to protect her son from essentially the kind of man he could have been, and in the end, she couldn't protect him anyway. He died doing what she feared he would, which is doing something dangerous.
Yeah, basically. Yeah. It's kind of sad that we didn't get to see Carol's reaction to
Well,
his
you
death.
have to. It's interesting because it's almost it's a complete foil for Sarek and Amanda, right?
Yeah.
Both raised their child, and then after the said child's death, like you said, pretty much reflected that they could have been less strict about, some things and how he was brought up, and essentially allowed him to develop more into who he was as opposed to who he should have been according to society and others. So
Yeah.
makes you wonder if Carol and Kirk would have come to the same conclusion had David Marcus, not died.
I'm also wondering if when Carol got the news, was she mad at Kirk or was she like, I don't know, was she like, I guess, more understanding?
Yeah. It was her son, so as you
Yeah.
can imagine, it would be horrific for her.
Yeah.
I can imagine, though, that would be the end to Carol and Kirk's relationship, even what was left of an old relationship.
I have a question.
Sure.
Is David does David make an appearance in the new movie's fan fiction? I know he doesn't make an appearance in the
Well,
movie.
here's the thing. Like I said, the whole cast in the Abrams verse is young. So really the only form David Marcus has ever taken is as Kirk's young son. So he's appeared in kid form, if you will. There's certainly stories out there where David Marcus is sort of like Kirk got Carol pregnant at a young age and, ended up having to raise the kid on his own or something like that, something to that effect. Or just Kirk in general is a parent. So I almost feel like in Abrams' verse, some of the fans are kind of making up for the fact that Kirk never raised the kid in the original series by letting him raise the kid in Fanon. But other than that, David Marcus, of course, doesn't really exist because Carol Marcus if she is pregnant when she leaves the crew of the Enterprise and never tells Kirk, I mean, we don't know that, so it's all speculation.
It's possible. I mean, yeah, it's possible.
It is possible. So, I mean, the way they set it up at the Into Darkness, it certainly could be like I said, follow very closely to how it is in canon in the original series. But again, would that Kirk make the same choice that the original series Kirk did, and that is to pursue his career instead of being a parent?
It's interesting because Kirk in the movies was, his father died. His father died when he was a baby.
Exactly.
So would he choose to be a missing father in his son's life? It's a very interesting question.
A lot of fans seem to think that he would choose the opposite. He would choose to be a father knowing what it is like for a kid to grow up without one.
Yeah. Well, that's all I have to say about David.
Same here.
So let's move on to the last character we're going to talk about today.
Yes. So this is sort of a new canon character in Star Trek Discovery, but also sort of bridges into original series canon. I mean, obviously it was set up that way since Discovery is a prequel to anything that occurred in the original series, and that is Michael Burnham. So I'm going to let you take it away because you are our Discovery expert, Soda.
Yeah. Well, Michael Burnham is supposedly Spock's adopted sister. Saavik adopted her when she was young. Her parents died because of a Klingon attack. And basically she was on the verge of death, and Saavik saved her by some Vulcan mind-meld trick. And ever since then, they were connected somehow psychically. And she grew up being a sister to Spock and being raised by Amanda and Saavik. And despite being fully human, she seemed to have been raised to be pretty Vulcan. I guess it's an interesting concept for a character. I think the execution is a little bit lacking in the series. Like, I don't think they really explored the conflict, but I kind of understand why, because I think it was pretty well explored with Spock in the original series. So it's kind of a rehash. But all in all, you know, Michael did grow up with Spock. The second season focuses heavily on how she was raised along with Spock and the relationship between them. It wasn't great. They had some conflict, mostly because Michael, who is older than Spock, pushed him away, basically.
So I read an article where the theory is that Spock's interactions with Michael when he was young sort of prepped him for his interactions with McCoy in the original series.
I don't know if it's true, because Michael grew up to be very kind of Vulcanish in her behavior, and she does understand Vulcan culture, and she respects it a lot.
Well,
and McCoy doesn't.
well,
Do all of these things.
no, but I meant the way that she antagonizes him and teases him.
It's possible, honestly.
Or have you not gotten
kind
to
of
that
possible.
episode?
I haven't. I don't think I've gotten into this episode. Of what I've seen so far, she kind of pushed him away when he was young. So I don't think they had that much interaction.
I think apparently there's an episode where they reconnect, and you see more of what they were like as siblings, arguing and having that witty repartee or whatever that is that he does with McCoy.
Yeah, I know about the witty repartee. It's possible. That's why I said it's possible. I know she kind of like mocks his beard, for example.
Right. Do you think, if anything, or maybe you don't think this at all, but how does Michael sort of change original series canon in the way it was established before Discovery started? I mean, outside of the fact that Spock has another sibling nobody knows about.
Yeah. Well, in terms of family, nobody knows about. Well, he doesn't really discuss his family all that much. Maybe he has like 15 siblings we don't know about. It would be just as likely. When it comes to changing the canon, well, I think there was an episode in the first season that kind of explains why Saavik was so mad at Spock for not joining the Vulcan Academy and instead going to Starfleet. And it portrays Saavik in a kind of bad light, and Spock's decision is more understandable. Basically, we discover that because Saavik married a human and the Vulcans are kind of racist to humans, they told Saavik that they'll only accept one child of his into the academy. And so when he was asked to choose between Michael getting into the academy or Spock, he chose Spock instead, and so they rejected Michael. And so Saavik encouraged Michael to go to Starfleet, thinking that Spock will enter the academy. And eventually, and Spock chose not to go to the academy too.
Right, and also ends up in Starfleet.
Yeah.
So you didn't win either one. Sorry.
Exactly.
Well, that's what you get for trying to push your children in one direction or another.
And that was really kind of sad, because Michael did want to go to the academy. So if you would just have let her go, so, maybe he wouldn't have had this conflict with Spock, but,
Well, I mean, again, parenting and pushing your expectations on a child.
Yeah.
So expecting Spock to be the one to go to the academy, I mean, really? Like you said, parents don't always make the best decisions.
Yeah.
And we see that many times throughout original series. So.
Yeah, but you also kind of get the impression that maybe it was better for both of them to end up in Starfleet, because the Vulcans are so racist to humans and half human.
Right.
I think the series in general puts a lot more focus on the anti-humans than
what is it about Vulcans and that if they're all about IDIC? So how can you be pro-diversity and still be racist?
Well, how can people in this world hold up some certain morals and then practice something different? it happens all
Well,
over. You say you believe one thing and then you do something that is completely against it. It happens.
So let me ask you a question. How popular do you think Michael is or will become because of Discovery? With original series fans.
If original series, I'm not so sure because, well, she is part of canon. You can't deny it. But if a big franchise like Star Trek, sometimes canon is what you feel in your heart is canon, and not exactly everything that is written to be canon.
You mean like McSpurk?
Yeah, but more like you believe whatever you want to believe. If you want to just treat original series canon as only things that happened in the original series and not consider, I don't know, the animated series and Discovery and the movies and the Next Generation and so on, then you can do that. Like a lot of original series fans ignore Generations because we don't want to believe Kirk is dead. So,
well, true. Yeah. So but I suppose I'm saying is how receptive have fans been to this new addition to Spock's family?
I actually don't think they were that receptive, again, because I think original series fans mostly focus on the original series and the movies. So other things from other canons, I feel from other Star Trek series and movies just don't factor in.
Do you think that will change now that the second season is focused on Spock and Michael?
It's possible, but I honestly don't believe it. I think, in Discovery fans really like Michael. But if you're not a Discovery fan and you're an original series fan, I don't see much of a reason to include her.
At least in fan, there are people who like both, obviously.
Yeah.
Talking to one. She's at least started to make her way into fan fiction. I will say that.
Yeah.
Or like original series fan fiction. And even alternate original series fan fiction, like Abrams verse, so the fact that he has a sister that no one knew about, I mean, that's kind of like a gold mine for plot, I suppose.
Yeah, I think Spock fans will get a lot out of it if they want to explore Spock's background more.
Has there been any indication, like, how far her storyline continues to overlap with the original series? Where will she be by the time Spock is under Kirk's captaincy?
There was no indication. Again, this season we are under Pike, so it's already more connected to the original series. On top of having Spock and Saavik and Amanda reoccurring too.
Mm-hmm. And we know just how little everybody knew about Spock serving under Pike because they were all shocked that he was close to Pike. Interesting. I wonder if she'll become, like, if she slowly fades away into the canon after, long before Spock is actually back in serving Pike, eventually to serve Kirk.
Actually, the showrunner said that next season Pike wouldn't be the captain. I think the captain seat in Discovery is kind of like a rotating kind of thing. Like every season there is a different.
Well, I mean, Spock served under Pike for what, 11 years?
I don't know exactly. Maybe.
I think it was like 11 years. So, I mean, Pike eventually has to go to being captain.
Yeah, he took command of the Discovery because of an emergency situation, not because it is
right
now.
And eventually Spock's got to go with him.
Spock will have to return with him.
So I
mean, Discovery makes a lot of points that kind of don't mesh with the original series, and it's sort of been theorized that by the end of the series they will find a way to make it all cohesive, but we don't know it yet.
Maybe they'll all jump forward in time and then Michael apparently goes missing, but they all did like a time leap, and Spock eventually gets to see her while he's on Romulus right before the supernova blows up, and then he ends up being shot back in time into an alternate universe.
That would be too complicated even for Star Trek.
Are you sure? Because it seems like they like to boomerang people around through time and space.
Maybe it will be like I don't know if you know it, Madoka Magica situation, where like she goes back in time and erases her existence.
So I guess that means you don't know who the Red Angel is.
I don't know.
I won't tell you. I won't spoil that for you.
It's a fact I should know.
Well, I think this has been a very fun and interesting conversation, Soda. It's nice to give the spotlight to some characters that we all know and love, but even in the original series might not have had the spotlight for long.
I agree. I like there are a lot of good background characters, I think, in Star Trek with a lot of potential.
And I think one of the main themes of Tenets in general in the original series is your family is who you make it, and family can be very important. So the bridge crew itself, I mean, the reason we all think about the original series, we don't think about just Kirk or just Spock. It's that iconic view of the bridge where you have Kirk and Spock and Chekov and Sulu and Scotty and Uhura and McCoy all standing on that bridge. I mean, that is, for me, that is what is the original series.
True.
It doesn't matter that Chekov came on later in the later in the season or, something like that. They are the original series, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
They really are.
So, and if I could, I would stick Chapel on the bridge and Doctor and Binga on the bridge and Janice on the bridge. And so there's always going to be those little characters that even if you see them only for a moment, you will probably fall in love with and just wish you could see more of. So it's a really good thing that we have fandom out there, because fandom is what gives love to those side characters.
Fandom's power is to really expand where canon couldn't.
And we've done a little of that ourselves today. And thank you to everyone who was listening. Until next time. Bye, Soda.
Bye.